Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something that maybe sounds obvious at first glance,
Right.
but our source material suggests there's a really key distinction hiding in plain sight.
Right.
We're exploring the difference between a teacher and teaching.
Mm-hmm.
This is all based on an article, Teacher and Teaching, Understanding the Difference Through Learnography.
It's a fascinating angle.
Yeah. So, have you, the listener, ever really thought about whether the person, the teacher, is actually the same thing as the act or the system of teaching?
It's something many people, even educators, might just kind of gloss over.
Exactly. And this article argues that getting this difference clear is crucial, especially because it introduces this alternative idea called learnography.
Which we'll definitely unpack.
Right. So our mission today is basically to unpack that distinction, teacher versus teaching, and see what this learnography concept is all about and how it might change how we think about learning.
It's a distinction that, often gets blurred in everyday talk about education. The terms just get used back and forth.
Right, interchangeably. So let's start there. The conventional view. When most people think teacher and teaching, what usually comes to mind?
Well, I think typically they're seen as, two sides of the same coin. A teacher teaches. Teaching is what a teacher does.
Seems straightforward.
It does. And the article points out that for a lot of educators, their professional identity is really wrapped up in the act of teaching. It's not just their job description. It's almost who they are professionally.
Makes sense. Okay, so the article wants us to sort of separate those two ideas. Let's get into that core distinction it makes. How does it define a teacher specifically?
So the article defines the teacher primarily as a person, a professional, yes, but someone who brings their whole humanity to the table.
Okay.
We're talking experience, definitely, but also empathy, interpersonal skills, a genuine desire to help others grow.
The human element.
Exactly. They're mentors, guides, potentially role models. The article actually calls the teacher a human resource of knowledge and guidance.
Human resource. That's interesting. It really leans into the person-to-person aspect, doesn't it? Not just information delivery.
Precisely. It reminds you of those teachers who really connect, where their personality and care were just as important as the subject matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a few like that. Okay, so that's the teacher as a person. How does the article then define teaching?
Teaching in this context is framed more as a system or a method, a practice. Specifically, the often conventional way knowledge gets delivered.
Conventional meaning?
Meaning typically quite verbal, very cognitive focused, and often driven by exams and assessments.
Okay. The traditional model.
Right. Think lectures, teacher explanations, students taking notes, tests based on recall, that kind of structure.
Got it. So what are the hallmarks of that traditional teaching system according to the article?
Well, a key thing is the direction of knowledge flow. Often it's primarily one way from the teacher who holds the knowledge to the students.
The sage on the stage idea.
Sort of, yeah. The emphasis can easily fall on students passively listening, maybe memorizing facts, with the teacher doing most of the talking, being the main source of information. You can picture that typical classroom layout.
Definitely can. Teacher up front, students listening. Hopefully. So what's the problem with relying too heavily on that system, that mode of teaching? What's the article's core argument there?
Okay, so this is where it gets really crucial. The argument is that when teaching, the method starts to overshadow the actual goal, which is learning. Problems arise.
Such as?
Well, for starters, it encourages that passive listening we just mentioned, hearing information versus actively grappling with it, making it your own.
Right. I've definitely sat through lectures like that. You hear it, but does it stick? Does it mean anything?
Exactly. And the article suggests there's often a mismatch, a disconnect between that traditional telling approach and how our brains actually seem to learn best.
How do our brains learn best then?
Often through doing, through exploring, practicing, making connections actively, not just listening. So when teaching is mainly about transmission, it might not align with natural learning processes.
And this disconnect, could that explain some frustrations, like for both teachers and students?
It seems very plausible. The article touches on this. It mentions the potential for teacher burnout. Educators work incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But if the method they're using or feel they have to use doesn't consistently lead to deep student understanding, that's tough. It's draining.
I can imagine. And for students?
Well, students can become disengaged, right? If they feel like they're just supposed to sit there and absorb rather than being active participants in figuring things out.
Passive recipients.
Yes. And this leads to a really key takeaway from the article. Teaching, no matter how skilled, doesn't automatically guarantee learning.
Wow. Say that again.
Teaching doesn't guarantee learning. The article argues that real education should be measured by how deeply something is actually learned and internalized by the student, not just by how well it was taught.
That really reframes things. Okay. So if that's the issue with overemphasizing traditional teaching, this is where learnography enters the picture as an alternative.
Exactly. And it's really important to stress, as the article does, learnography isn't knocking teachers at all.
Right. It's not blaming them.
Not at all. It's presented as a critique of those maybe outdated teaching models. Learnography wants to shift the focus away from teacher-centric instruction towards student-centered, brain-based learning, learning by doing.
Okay. Learning by doing. What does that look like in practice? What are the principles of learnography?
The article lays out a few core ideas. One is this concept of students building a brain page.
Or brain page.
Yeah, think of it like a personalized mental map or module where knowledge is actively constructed and integrated by the learner. It's not just received, it's built.
Interesting. What else?
Another idea is that classrooms or learning spaces should function more like miniature schools.
Miniature schools.
Yeah.
Meaning students take on more roles.
Kind of, yeah. More ownership, more responsibility for their own learning path within that space. And interestingly, learnography also stresses integrating motor skills.
Motor skills.
Yeah.
Physical activity. How does that fit in with learning, say, history or math?
Well, the idea is that physical engagement, interacting with things, moving, it can actually strengthen learning and memory. It pushes back against learning being purely sedentary, just listening or reading.
Okay, that's different.
Yeah, and instead of just lectures, learnography structures learning through activities that are space-guided, object-driven, and time-bound.
So more hands-on structured activities.
Exactly. Less passive listening, more active doing within a designed environment.
So if teaching is the old system and learnography is this new approach, what happens to the teacher? What's their role in a learnography setup?
It definitely shifts, big time. Instead of being the primary talker or deliverer of information,
Sage on the stage.
right, the teacher becomes more of a navigator.
A navigator, I like that.
Yeah. Their main job becomes designing those effective learning spaces and activities, guiding the process, making sure each student is finding their way, making progress, less directing, more facilitating individual journeys.
That sounds like a really different, maybe more dynamic role. And the article talks about how this also reframes the teacher's identity.
It does. It really encourages educators to see themselves as more than just instructors.
As what then?
As facilitators of knowledge transfer, as architects of learning experiences, designers of these interactive environments. It's a broader, perhaps more creative view of the role.
And how does that shift potentially help everyone involved? The teachers, the students?
Well, for teachers, the article suggests this reframing can lead to greater professional fulfillment. Instead of feeling like you're just trying to pour knowledge in,
Which can be frustrating.
right, you become a catalyst for genuine discovery and understanding. That can be really energizing. And for students, it's about fostering curiosity, autonomy, deeper engagement, because they're doing the learning, building their own brain page.
It sounds much more active for everyone.
That's the goal.
Now, you mentioned earlier, and the article stresses, that teachers are being blamed for the shortcomings of the traditional system.
Yes, that's a really critical point they make. It explicitly says, look, teachers are generally doing their absolute best within systems that often limit creativity and personalized learning.
Systems with constraints, standardized tests, curriculum demands.
Exactly. People go into teaching wanting to make a difference, but the structure they work within, the dominant instructional model, can sometimes hold them back from using more innovative, student-centered methods.
So the issue isn't the dedication of the teacher.
Yeah.
It's the model itself, the traditional teaching framework.
Precisely. The article argues it's the method that needs updating, shifting towards these brain-based approaches like learnography. It respects teachers' experience while valuing student agency and active construction of knowledge.
Okay. So pulling this all together then, what are the main benefits the article highlights for making this shift towards something like learnography?
Well, the big ones are empowering students, giving them real ownership over their learning, redefining the teacher's role into something potentially more dynamic and fulfilling that navigator or architect idea.
Right.
And ultimately, creating learning environments that are more active, maybe even more joyful, where deep understanding can actually happen.
And the article has some specific calls to action.
It does. It encourages educators to separate their identity from just the traditional method, to question those conventions, to maybe explore learnography, transform their physical classrooms, empower students more directly, and really see themselves as change makers.
So it's quite ambitious.
It is. The ultimate goal, as the article frames it, is about elevating how knowledge gets transferred and learned, making that brain page learning a much more engaging and effective reality.
Right. So to really boil down this deep dive, the core message is this vital split between the teacher, the person with their skills and empathy in teaching the system, which, if too traditional, can actually hinder real learning.
That's the crux of it.
And Learnography is offered as one potential path forward, focusing squarely on active, student-driven learning.
A clear and accurate summary, yeah.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. How might this distinction, person versus method, apply outside of school? Think about any situation where knowledge or skills are shared. Your work, hobbies, even family life. What happens if you focus more on the learning taking place, rather than just the teaching or explaining? How could that shift change things for you or the people you interact with?
That's a great question to ponder. And if this idea of learnography itself has piqued your interest, the article does mention checking out the Tax-Sheila page for more information on that specific approach.
It definitely seems like our understanding of how we learn best is always evolving. It's exciting to think about models that put the learner truly at the center. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.